Welcome to Grace to Endure. In this video, we're just going to be looking at the first command that Jesus gave us as he was departing from us and going into heaven. He told us to make disciples everywhere we go. So we want to just look at a few texts and see if we can find some ideas that the Bible gives us on how to make disciples well. We're going to start by just reading Matthew 28, which is where this command is first given. And we're just going to then kind of look into it and look at some of the details. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Now we're actually going to do point 3, that it's what's in that last sentence, I am with you always. We're going to do point 3 first because this is necessary in order to make disciples. You have to be a believer. You have to be a disciple yourself. Okay, so we need to remember that it's the Holy Spirit that's with us. I have in Romans and Corinthians some references to the Holy Spirit being inside of believers. And so inside of every believer is the Holy Spirit. And so that is how we then do back up to point 1, and that is giving the gospel. So the first point in making disciples is you're working with the Holy Spirit as partners. Okay, so we give the gospel clearly, and then the gospel is the tool that the Holy Spirit uses to then save people, to convict them of sin and then save them. Okay, so we work with the Holy Spirit in this process of making disciples, and our only part in it is just saying the gospel clearly. Okay, and then God does the rest. Point number 2 is in every nation. So in every nation, whether you live in a country where it's legal or where it's illegal to give the gospel, we are still commanded to say it out. Okay, now there is going to be a time in the future where it will be illegal in every single nation. We're not there yet, but that will happen, and we will have to count that cost. But it is worth it because we care about the eternal souls of the unbelievers. Point number 3 actually has 2 points to it. The first one being that once someone has become a believer, they need to get baptized. But in all the examples of the New Testament, we see the leaders of the church are doing that. So that's why I have that in blue to kind of set it apart, because that's not something all of us can do. But however, if we look at B, we see that this is something that we can all take part in. Yes, pastors and teachers have a special role in teaching the commands of Christ, but it is something that we do as all of us are discipling others who have become new believers. So what are we doing then? What is discipling? It's just teaching them the commands of Christ. So what this entire series is about, of the commands of Christ. So it's basically just opening up the New Testament, taking each command in its context and teaching that. So it's more simple than I think we sometimes think. We often think that in order to do discipling, we have to be at like a certain level. Now, you do have to be a believer. And then once you become a believer, it would be wise to make sure that you are studying and learning things, right? You don't want to be acting like you know things you don't know. We're going to talk more about that in detail on the next slide. But it is important that we understand these basic points of making disciples, that it's not as complicated as we sometimes make it. It's not an unreachable or unattainable thing. It's really just teaching the commands of Christ. Let's start in Luke chapter 6 and read what we can get from this text on discipleship. He also told them a parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Won't they both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye and don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take out the splinter that is in your eye," when you yourself don't see the beam of wood that is in your eye? Hypocrite! First take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter in your brother's eye. Okay, so we can see that there is some reference to being trained, taught, guided, and discipled in this passage. So there's a few things we want to take from this. Number 1, I want to point out that you really do not want to disciple on something that you don't know. So the blind shouldn't lead the blind, or they're both going to end up in a pit. But then if you look at the bottom right, I have a guy who is not blind, and he's leading the blind, and that's a good thing, okay? Because he's going to avoid the pit. All right? So number one, when you are discipling, is make sure that you just teach what you know. And if you don't know, you need to be humble and say, I actually don't know that. Maybe we can study it together, or we'll look at that another time, but I don't really know that. So when you are starting out with discipling, start number one with the gospel. Get really good at first making disciples as far as it goes giving the gospel. Once you have learned how to give the gospel, then you can start taking people who are already saved, okay? And you keep on giving the gospel. That's just a thing that we want to do throughout our whole Christian life, right? It's not like you do that a few times and then you stop. That's not what I mean. Keep doing that. But then also add to it the ability to teach on certain specific things that you do know. So make sure that you study. Study before you teach. This is important. You want to come equipped. You want to be studied. You're not going to know everything about every topic. There's just no way. But pick topics that you do know a little bit about. You do have a little bit of experience in as a Christian, and study that. And so if you're going to do a little Bible study with someone, pick a topic that you do know something about. Or you can say to them, if it's something you don't know a lot about, you can say, I don't know a lot about this topic, but I'd like to learn it together with you. I do know how to study the Bible, and so let's just study the Bible together, and we'll dig in together. Okay, so that's definitely, you can do it alongside. That's definitely an option. Okay, but you need to be humble and make sure that you're not acting like you know more than you do know. Okay, and that's this next point. Another point that you've got to remember as you're discipling is to be humble. You do not need to think of yourself like you're lording it over them, like I'm so much more above this person or something. We don't want to be doing that, okay? Because we all sin in many ways. And so we need to be humble as we disciple, and make sure that if there's like a specific thing that you're teaching about, and it's something that you struggle with, don't give the appearance of, I'm perfect at this. Try not to do that. Try to make sure that you're humble about it, and you're like, yeah, I struggle with this too, but together we should stop doing this and we should replace it with this command of Christ, right? So we can definitely acknowledge that together. But make sure that you are remaining humble and not being hypocritical, and just wanting everyone else to change their sins, but then like keeping your own pet sins. That's obviously, you cannot be doing that as a disciple. You need to be humble. Okay. And then we want to teach and we want to guide, which means to show the way or tell the way. That's kind of like the guiding and the teaching. I looked it up, what these words specifically mean. And so you're letting them know, like, what does the Bible say about it? What does the Bible say about this issue or this thing? But then there's training, which is also mentioned. And that has, it's a little bit different of a word, and it means to like repair and adjust, to mend, to make perfect, to equip. So it's, you are, as the person, as you're going through life, and you're like, they share a story of something, how they handled a situation, and you can be like, well, yeah, it'd probably be better to handle it this way because of this verse here. And so what you're doing is you're training, you're showing them how to adjust what they're doing now that they're a believer. So, well, as fellow believers, we want to make sure we don't handle that situation next time like this. Maybe you need to go and apologize for that. You need to make that right. You need to mend it. You need to make adjustments, because that is not following Christ's commands. We want to change it to being the right way of doing this. And so this is what you're doing as you are discipling, okay? Is you are equipping them so that the next time that situation comes up, they can handle it now with knowledge of what God says to do in those circumstances. I wanted to give a real life example because I was having a conversation about this very thing just this last week. I went to the beach with a friend, and so it was a long trip there. So we had a long time to talk, and this topic actually came up. And I was explaining to her about my childhood and how my grandparents were. So, my grandparents had a big influence on my life. And so my grandpa very much discipled me, and so did my grandma. And so I wanted to kind of show how he did it as an example, because I've used them as an example. And I think they have helped me so much, just what they have done to help me to know how to do it, that I thought it might encourage you. So, if you look on the far left, you see me, and that's supposed to be me. When I was little, I was 4 years old, and I am sitting there on a tractor with my grandpa. So when I was really little, I used to just go outside, and I just spent the whole day with my grandpa. And then some days I spent with my grandma indoors, okay? And that's usually how it was. He was usually outside. He was mending, repairing, fixing, all kinds of things, and keeping up the property. We had 20 acres, and there were always things to be done. Okay. And so when I was little, I would just sit there in his lap, and he would slowly teach me how to drive the tractor. And it was a big steering wheel. So he'd have his hands up there, and my little hands would be down here, and he'd be like, all right, so, this is when you do this, and this is when you do this. And, and he would just explain everything he was doing and why he was doing it. And he did that for about 2 years. Then when I got to, because I would always say, I want to do it. And he would let me steer it, right there sitting in his lap. But then I couldn't drive it on my own because I couldn't step on the brake. And so he's like, well, as soon as you can step on that brake and make this thing stop, and when you're strong enough to do that, I'll let you drive it on your own. Now, if you know about a tractor, they can go super slow, and so you can set it in a big open area. But that's what he did at first. So he taught me little by little. And when I turned 6, I was finally able to step on the brake. I literally had to take both of my feet and jump on the brake to make it stop. But I was so excited. And so then what he would do is he would walk by the side. As you can see, he'd walk on the side, and he'd give me instructions. So he'd been giving me instructions for 2.5 years. And then now he was giving me the same instructions, but he was standing off to the side, and I was going really slow. But he would do this thing, which was really interesting. He would let me just kind of get really close to making a mistake, and then he'd say, stop. And I had learned to just like obey on command, right? So I'd stop immediately, and he'd go, okay, so that front end loader, because it looked like this, it was a front end loader. So you see that big thing up in the front, okay? And so he'd be like, if you keep going, what's going to happen if you keep going at that angle? And I'm like, well, the front end loader is going to hit that tree, because there were trees, I had to learn how to get through all the trees. There's a lot of trees in certain places. And so he'd say, okay, so you need to reverse to your exact angle that you came from. And then we're going to have to turn that wheel a different way, right? We're going to have to correct it. Because if you do that same thing again, you're going to hit the tree. And so I'd reverse back to the original spot. And he'd say, okay, now which way do you think you need to turn this wheel in order to not hit that tree as you go forward here? And I'd be like, okay, I got to do this way. And he'd say, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. Go real slow. So I'd go real slow, and I'd almost hit maybe a tree over on the opposite side. And he's like, all right, stop. So I'd stop, and he's like, now what's going to happen? You went too far. Like you corrected too far over here. And so he let me see it in slow motion. It was so slow. And he'd be like, all right, so you're going to have to back up, and you're going to have to redo it. Where do you need to then where do these tires need to be? They don't need to be over here. They don't need to be facing over there. Where do they need to face? And I'd have to get the exact angle, and he would teach me ever so slowly, very patiently. And I'd eventually get it right, and I could maneuver between the trees and whatever was there. And so I started to get very good at it. Now, by the time I was quite a bit older, I don't know the exact age, but you can see me more over on the right side. And it got to where he trusted me so much, because I had learned it and I had mastered it, that I would help him take down trees. And some of the trees were very dangerous. And I was telling my friend about this. And I was like, it's really incredible. Like, I think about the responsibility that I had, but it was really good for me. It taught me. And he always had me out of danger. But he would take these cable cords, because we would have trees that would be maybe they might fall on a house, or they could fall on the barn, or whatever, the shed, all these different things. And so in order to prevent them from falling the wrong way, we'd have to take the tree down in the direction and angle that it needed to come. Well, he would take these cables and he would connect them to up the high branches, and then he would have them connected to the tractor where I was. And there was always a lot of extra so that I could never get hurt. But he could get hurt if I didn't learn and listen and obey. And so he would be down there with the saw, and it was I remember the hair on the back of my head just like standing up on the back of my neck, not my head, excuse me, on the back of my neck, because I was so nervous, because I didn't want to hurt him. I also didn't want to hurt the house. I didn't want to, and so it was very important that I had learned and I had listened. And so all of those corrections that he taught me along the way, they got me to this point where at one point he could actually depend on me to be able to do this whenever it was necessary. And so he would do what he needed to do, and then I had to wait until the tree started to be ready to come down. It would have this crack sound, and then he would run out of the way, and then I would yank those cables back with the tractor and pull the tree in the correct direction so that it wouldn't hit anything that it wasn't supposed to hit. It's supposed to come down in the right direction. And so we would work together, and this is just one example of the things that we would do, but I learned it little by little, listening to his instruction. He was teaching me, you see, things he knew. He studied a lot. He would make diagrams before he would ever take down a tree. He did a lot of work, and this is a really important thing. He would always teach me with the Bible alongside of it, and he'd say the reason why we plan is because in Proverbs it teaches us that it's wise to plan, okay? And it also talks about counting the cost and making sure you're ready to do something before you do it. So we're going to do that. And so see, he was discipling me, and so he would show me, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to study. And we'd come up with a plan. And then he was always very humble about it. He would pray and ask God for help. He did not trust only his study, for sure, or his knowledge. He really did ask the Lord for help. And then he'd take his hat off and he'd explain why he was even doing that. And he'd show me the scriptures about that. And he just along the way, day in and day out, showed me what he was doing and why he was doing it, including why the Bible and the commands of Christ had anything to do with how he took down trees. But it really actually did. It impacted his day throughout the entire day. And so he showed me humility and studying and teaching what you know, and patience and guidance and correcting. He would show me and tell me what to do. And then he would see me messing up, he'd say, back up. No. You got to do it like this. Or what's it going to make happen? This could happen. That could happen. You don't want to do that. So no, don't do that. Do this. And so my job was to listen and learn and be a humble listener and a humble learner. And so I learned that when I was a little girl, and it's just so valuable. And I could tell you more stories about my grandma doing the same thing, teaching me sewing and all these things that she taught me as well. But she had the same kind of method of explaining and showing and discipling. So I hope that this example gives you some practical application of how, why is it necessary to show and to tell? Why isn't it just telling? Why isn't it just teaching and guiding? Why do you need to train? Why does there need to be repair and adjustment? And why do you need to mend? And it's because you're trying to equip them for later on, right? And so I hope that this gives you an example that you can follow when you're discipling, and kind of what it's about. You're really trying to equip that person so that they can handle the circumstances of their lives and the moments of their days with the commands of Christ. And they can see how those apply to the situations of their days. As we disciple, and it is important that we do, as we go and we find people who maybe we can help to grow in their faith, it is important that we keep the attitude here that we see in 1 Corinthians 11:1. Imitate me as I also imitate Christ. So if there is something that you see me doing that you could point to commands of Christ and say, hey, that kind of looks like that verse, copy those things. If you see me doing something that's not me imitating Christ, don't copy those things. So keeping that humble attitude of, I'm not going to do it completely perfectly, but I definitely am commanded to do it. And I need to be attempting to do that, but with humility, admitting when I'm wrong and correcting when I'm wrong, and coming alongside and showing those who are younger in the faith how to do it and how to incorporate the commands of Christ into our everyday way of thinking.